Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we are going to be talking about The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. First published 1890. So this means this is our first book from the 19th century that we're discussing on this podcast. I told you we would eventually get to the 19th century. So this is going to be a very entertaining book to kick off the 19th century with, of course. Now, for a book like this, obviously, whenever a lot of times we read books that have a certain cultural presence. A lot of these books are novels which people have a sense of or have an idea of. This is definitely true of The Great Gatsby, which we discussed a few weeks ago. With Oscar Wilde, right, with The Picture of Dorian Gray, I think Oscar Wilde himself as a writer obviously has a sort of presence in the culture. People associate certain philosophies, certain values with Oscar Wilde. People associate a certain, obviously, witticism with Oscar Wilde. With The Picture of Dorian Gray, people often describe it as a gothic novel, right, or a horror novel. I understand that these labels, people find these labels useful sometimes, right, to think of something as a gothic novel or a horror novel. Personally, I actually don't find those labels too useful. Oftentimes because I think those labels, in an attempt to kind of label these books under certain genre categories, we often obscure what I think is the true genius of a lot of these books. Yes, this novel has gothic elements and horror elements to it, right? Obviously, most famously, the picture, the titular picture, right? As everyone knows, the picture ages while Dorian does not age. But I think to reduce the novel to this simple device is really to miss the point of what makes this a masterpiece. So I'm not so interested in the gothic stuff and the horror stuff. I'm interested in this novel, as I've been with all the novels we've discussed, for what it says about the era in which Oscar Wilde lived. Again, that's been my definition of a great book from the very first episode we did on Brideshead Revisited. A great book, a great work of literature, is one that is in dialogue with its own time period, which says something about the era in which it came from. And Oscar Wilde is not just writing some horror story, not just trying to write some fun gothic story. He is trying to say something about the Victorian era, and he is trying to say something about aestheticism, the great artistic movement that he was a part of, the movement that basically he defines in the preface to Dorian Gray, the movement which essentially says art for art's sake. Right? In the preface, if you take a look at the very last line, what does he say in the last line of the preface? All art is quite useless. That's essentially the motto, you could say, one of the mottos of aestheticism. All art is quite useless. Now, he doesn't mean that in a pejorative way. What he means is that art is not about moral instruction. Art is not about utility. You don't get something from art. Sometimes art, in this case literature, is about something beyond those categories, is about aesthetic experience. And one thing that I think he's doing in The Picture of Dorian Gray is I think he is attempting to dramatize aestheticism as a movement, and to talk about the attempt by certain characters to live what we think of as an aesthetic life, and obviously ultimately the failure to accomplish that. We're going to talk about the ending a lot. We're going to talk about the meaning of the ending, obviously, and what I think Wilde is trying to say. I do think this novel is far more than just a simple morality tale, which is also how some people sometimes talk about it. I'll say this. I remember once that I was having dinner with some people that I knew, right, in college, and we were talking about this novel in particular, and many of them objected to my idea that the novel was more than just a critique of Dorian or a critique of aestheticism. I tried to argue back then in college that this novel was actually Wilde's way of trying to dramatize the tragedy of someone unable to live this kind of life despite wanting to. A lot of the people who I was speaking to at the time didn't quite believe me. I can say this podcast is my attempt to vindicate myself, vindicate my own reading. 15 years later, having reread this novel, I believe that my interpretation in college was correct. That this novel is not simply a critique of Dorian and of Henry and of all the aesthetes in this, right? Instead, I think the novel is so much more sophisticated. So my, I think, interpretation of this novel really centers on one thing that's a bit unconventional. I actually believe that the protagonist of the novel, so obviously the protagonist of the novel is Dorian. I think that's unquestionable, right? He's the one who experiences the traditional arc, right, that we see in stories. He's the one who experiences a character change. He's the one who the central event of the story happens to. But I think Wilde very intelligently positions us, the readers, not in the position of Dorian, especially at the beginning, but really in the position of Henry, Lord Henry Wotton. Some people argue he is the antagonist of the story, the villain of the story, the Mephistopheles figure who seduces Dorian and influences him with this aesthetic ideal that Dorian then attempts to pursue throughout the novel. Essentially, Lord Henry is the reason Dorian makes the wish that the painting would age instead of him. Now, I believe, and we're going to see some proof of this in the way Wilde writes the beginning, I believe that Lord Henry is actually meant to be the audience stand-in. Wilde positions us often in Lord Henry's point of view, in Lord Henry's perspective. And even towards the end, when the novel has mostly shifted to Dorian's point of view, we are still kind of watching Dorian as if we are Lord Henry. And I'll point out some passages where I think this really comes through. But I want to start out by looking at the very beginning of the novel, the very first opening set of paragraphs, which I think fit my sort of interpretation here, right? So let's just look at the very beginning. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. So we don't yet have a character introduced yet in the first sentence. We simply have a studio, and we have the odor of flowers, the odor of roses. So Wilde wants to put us immediately in a particularly sensory mood and experience, right? He wants us to smell the roses, smell the summer wind, hear it amongst the trees in the garden, right? Smell the lilac, right? And the pink flowering thorn. Obviously, flowers are going to be a really important symbol. But let's look at the paragraph that comes right after this. From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags on which he was lying, smoking, as was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-colored blossoms of a laburnum, whose tremulous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame-like as theirs. And now and then the fantastic shadows of birds in flight flitted across the long tussore silk curtains that were stretched in front of the huge window, producing a kind of momentary Japanese effect, and making him think of those pallid, jade-faced painters of Tokyo who, through the medium of an art that is necessarily immobile, seek to convey the sense of swiftness and motion. So, one thing to remember, right, is at this time, Japanese art was kind of a fad among the aesthetes of London, of England, right? They were really into Japan for its aesthetic beauty. And so we sort of see a little bit of that here, right? Henry is comparing what he sees to the effect produced by Japanese art. But I think the point that I want to make here is that whose perspective are we in? We are not in Dorian's perspective, who we often think of as our protagonist of the novel. We are not in Basil's perspective. He's the painter. He's kind of the moral voice of the novel in some ways. He's the one who warns Dorian not to pursue the path he's going on, and he's the one who Dorian obviously kills in the middle of the novel. We're not in his perspective either. In fact, we're barely in Basil's perspective. Even though he is the moral voice of the novel, he's really not in the novel very much. We are in Lord Henry's perspective, and I think that's important. Wilde does not necessarily want us to see Lord Henry as a villain. I think in reality, Wilde is playing with the idea of point of view to force us to inhabit the point of view of a character who normal moralistic Victorians might find objectionable. I think Wilde is having fun with us through this opening two chapters by forcing us to inhabit the point of view of a character who, as we're going to see, is going to make these pronouncements about art and aesthetics that push back against traditional Victorian morality. Henry's entire philosophy is aestheticism. He believes art should be about art, and more than just that, he believes people should live life outside of morality. We're going to look at some of his epigrams. In a way, Wilde is kind of satirizing himself to some extent, or at least playing with the image that he has of this witty decadent. But I do think it's important that we are in Henry's point of view, that we are starting the novel from his perspective. In novels, right, the point of view that the writer chooses is really significant. And I know it's very fashionable to often read against the grain sometimes, to sort of say, oh, well, even though we are in this character's point of view, the novel is really a critique of this character's point of view. That might be true in some cases, but more often than not, the perspective that the writer makes us inhabit is chosen for a reason. Partly because the nature of the way novels are written, we develop a natural empathy for our point of view character, even sometimes against our will. And so here, regardless of what we think of Lord Henry, we are always going to be slightly empathetic towards him because we are in his point of view. And we are in his point of view a lot in this novel. And so Lord Henry is not this antagonistic figure lurking in the shadows. No, as we see in the beginning, he is us. We are Lord Henry. And that's a point that Wilde, I think, is making intentionally with the way he sets up this novel. So continuing on, let's just look at a few of Lord Henry's moments of dialogue at the beginning. Because when we think of what is the sort of primary conflict of the novel, it's kind of kicked off by Lord Henry influencing Dorian to pursue beauty and pleasure over the kind of traditional ideals of morality. So, moving into chapter 2, let's take a look at, there's a paragraph towards the middle of chapter 2 where Henry is talking to Dorian, and Dorian at this time is basically standing and being painted by Basil, sort of finishing the painting. Obviously, Lord Henry's influence is going to be really important. I want to read this long passage where we sort of get Lord Henry's first bit of ideological influence, you could say, on Dorian. I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal, to something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal it may be. But the bravest man amongst us is afraid of himself. The mutilation of the savage has its tragic survival in the self-denial that mars our lives. We are punished for our refusals. Every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. The body sins once and has done with its sin, for action is a mode of purification. Nothing remains then but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of a regret. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. It has been said that the great events of the world take place in the brain. It is in the brain and the brain only that the great sins of the world take place also. You, Mr. Gray, you yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, you have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. So, it's a long passage, right? And obviously, like I said, we have been placed in Henry's point of view from the beginning of the novel, which is what makes a passage like this a little complex. We might not agree with what Henry is saying. We might feel a certain moral compunction, right? We might feel that, oh no, he's wrong. We shouldn't just sin because it doesn't just happen in the brain. There are external effects of sin. But Oscar Wilde has challenged us because he has forced us to inhabit Lord Henry's perspective at the beginning and at different points throughout this whole opening scene. So even though we might not agree with what we hear him saying, we are him in this scene. we're not really Dorian so much. We are like Lord Henry looking at this beautiful boy and thinking, wouldn't it be something if he could live his life without the pressures of morality, without the pressures of the idea of sin, right? What is the phrase that he uses in this passage? How your soul will grow sick with longing for the things it has forbidden itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. I mean, he's basically saying, yeah, like Victorian society has made these monstrous laws. It's made certain things monstrous and unlawful, and our souls long for those monstrous things. Imagine a Victorian reader reading this, perhaps slightly alarmed, right, by what Lord Henry is saying, and yet perhaps also recognizing a truth in what he's saying. So then, the rest of this opening chapter, right, Dorian basically falls prey to Lord Henry's influences, and the result is that he makes this declaration when he sees the painting. He wishes that the painting would be the one that ages and not him. So, the first 2 chapters, we see the whole opening drama play out. The primary conflict of the novel gets started. Now, from here, so one thing I do want to say, in these sections, we are also in Dorian's point of view as well. We are with him when he is influenced by Lord Henry, when he is thinking about what Lord Henry is saying, and we are also with him when he makes the decision to look at the portrait. So I'm not arguing that Dorian is somehow not the protagonist of this novel. He most certainly is. But my big interpretive lens to look at this novel is Lord Henry is in many ways also a protagonist, or at least, if he's not a protagonist, he is a character whose point of view is important to Oscar Wilde. And, as I said, whose point of view will continue to be the point of view that the audience kind of centers itself on, even as Dorian kind of takes over more of the novel. We see a little bit of this in chapter 3, right? So if we think about chapter 3, again, we are not in Dorian's point of view now. We are in Lord Henry's point of view, going to a party, basically. And this entire section is told from Lord Henry's point of view, and he learns about Dorian. And think about what's going on here. He is learning about Dorian, just as we, the audience, are learning about Dorian. And so once again, we are placed in Henry's point of view. Dorian is this fascinating, beautiful young man who Lord Henry wants to learn more about. We are essentially in that exact same position. So I want to look at this one paragraph kind of towards the middle of this passage, right, where Lord Henry is thinking about Dorian. So it's this paragraph that starts with the phrase, "So that was the story of Dorian Gray's parentage." Now, I like this passage, and I think this paragraph is really key, because again, we are in Lord Henry's perspective, and Lord Henry is thinking all of these things. We are not hearing these things said to us from an outside voice. We are Lord Henry as we are thinking of these things. So once again, Oscar Wilde is forcing us to inhabit the point of view of someone who is fully on board with aestheticism as a movement. And how charming he had been at dinner the night before, as with startled eyes and lips parted in frighted pleasure, he had sat opposite to him at the club, the red candle shades staining to a richer rose the wakening wonder of his face. Talking to him was like playing upon an exquisite violin. He answered to every touch and thrill of the bow. There was something terribly enthralling in the exercise of influence. No other activity was like it. To project one's soul into some gracious form and let it tarry there for a moment, to hear one's own intellectual views echoed back to one with all the added music of passion and youth, to convey one's temperament into another as though it were a subtle fluid or a strange perfume. There was a real joy in that, perhaps the most satisfying joy left to us in an age so limited and vulgar as our own, an age grossly carnal in its pleasures and grossly common in its aims. So I love that passage, well, for a few reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of sexual innuendo in the way Oscar Wilde writes that, and he seems to relish the different metaphors. There is, of course, something sexual, right, in the relationship between Dorian and Henry. Not in a literal sense, but in this kind of abstracted aesthetic sense. Henry and Dorian and Basil, of course, are all coded as gay in this novel, sometimes pretty explicitly so. And Henry is talking here about influencing Dorian, and he uses certain homoerotic metaphors, right, to convey this. But the larger point, I think, of this passage that I want to emphasize is think of the idea of point of view. So we are not hearing Henry say this to someone else. We are in Henry's head as he's thinking these things. This idea of the marvelous beauty of influence. Again, Henry may be our technical villain, right? He may be the kind of devilish figure luring Dorian to ultimately to his demise, although that's not necessarily Henry's intention here, right? He just wants Dorian to live this aesthetic life that Henry has always dreamed of and hoped for and longed for. But I think it's important to emphasize that even if Henry is the devil, even if he is the Mephistopheles figure in this, Faustian story, Oscar Wilde is basically saying, well, he's forcing us to be in the perspective of the devil. He is saying, what if we were Henry, right? What if we were the ones who could influence a person? I want to sort of talk a little bit about why I think this is, right? Because, and this gets into my larger kind of idea about this novel, that it's not really a critique of aestheticism. Because Oscar Wilde, really, he believed a lot of the same things that Lord Henry believes, right? He believes that Victorian morality is bad and flawed and limiting. He wants a kind of aesthetic freedom. He wants to return to this Hellenic ideal that both Henry and Basil discuss in the opening chapter. And in a way, Dorian Gray becomes this object that Lord Henry can manipulate to achieve these aesthetic ideals. And so Oscar Wilde kind of positions himself and positions us not in the point of view of the object, not in the point of view of the person being manipulated, but in the point of view of the manipulator. He essentially wants, I think, to imagine, what if we were given this opportunity to see our aesthetic dreams acted out in real life, our aesthetic visions acted out? What if we were given the most beautiful, perfect person who could come to embody all of these values? What would happen? And what we're going to see, and what I think Oscar Wilde is going to dramatize in this novel, is it doesn't quite work out the way Lord Henry intended when he first started influencing Dorian. We're going to look at some passages at the end which sort of point to this. But essentially, again, my larger point with this novel is it's not a critique of aestheticism, but a lament that a true aesthetic life in which art and beauty are the only things that matter and that morality can be ignored, a true aesthetic life is actually impossible in the Victorian era, and maybe even the world in general. That's, I think, what Oscar Wilde is dramatizing here. In a way, you could argue, in sort of a twisted way, Lord Henry is a tragic figure. And that might be a strange thing to hear me say at this point, but when we get to the end, I'll return to that point, that Lord Henry is in some ways a tragic figure in this novel, and I'll point to exactly why I think that's the case. I think Oscar Wilde sees himself more as Lord Henry than as anyone else in this novel, because he basically desires what Lord Henry desires in a way, right? To see this aesthetic ideal made real. So I want to look at a moment in chapter 8 now. So this is the section where, Dorian has fallen in love with Sybil, an actress, and he's taken Henry and Basil to go see her perform. And Sybil ends up being very bad as an actress because after having fallen in love with Dorian, she, acting no longer means anything to her, right? There's a long section where it's sort of explained why, right? She's no longer a great actress once Dorian has expressed his love. But this, of course, makes Dorian unhappy. And eventually, he rejects her and she dies, right? She commits suicide. This is kind of part of the dramatic Gothic elements to some extent, right? The sort of overwrought side of this novel. But I think what's interesting is to look at Lord Henry's reaction and advice to Dorian, which again it's quite dark, right? This is where the sort of devilishness of Lord Henry comes in. But what does he say to Dorian? He says, "You must think of that lonely death in the tawdry dressing room simply as a strange lurid fragment from some Jacobean tragedy, as a wonderful scene from Webster or Ford or Cyril Tourneur. The girl never really lived, and so she has never really died. To you, at least, she was always a dream, a phantom that flitted through Shakespeare's plays and left them lovelier for its presence, a reed through which Shakespeare's music sounded richer and more full of joy. The moment she touched actual life, she marred it, and it marred her, and so she passed away. Mourn for Ophelia, if you like. Put ashes on your head because Cordelia was strangled. Cry out against heaven because the daughter of Brabantio died. But don't waste your tears over Sybil Vane. She was less real than they are. So Lord Henry is basically, again, what is Lord Henry's goal? He's trying to get Dorian to live this perfect, artistic, aesthetic life above morality. And the truth is, Dorian actually in this moment feels quite sad at Sybil's death, and he blames himself. And Henry's trying to tell him, don't blame yourself. She's like, think of her as a character in a play. Think of her first and foremost as an actress and not as a real person. Don't mourn for her. And at this point, this advice works. Lord Henry's advice works. Again, if we try and read this novel as Lord Henry as one of the protagonists and Dorian as the second protagonist, what is Lord Henry doing here? He is trying to get Dorian to continue to live the way he wants. In a way, we could say Lord Henry's goal in this novel is to create the perfect embodiment of aestheticism, a person who has no morality and purely lives for art and beauty. And here we see him attempting that, right? Attempting to wrestle Dorian away from this feeling of melancholy, right? This feeling of guilt. And here he is successful. But again, this is still early in the novel. What we're going to contrast this with eventually is towards the end of the novel, when Lord Henry's advice stops working on Dorian. So, the middle of the novel, Dorian then basically comes to embody Lord Henry's way of living. He really totally kind of rejects morality. And years pass and we start to see Dorian not aging, right, while all the other characters around him age. Eventually, I think 20 years are going to pass. We're going to see Dorian looking just like he did at 20, but at 40. So let's look at some of these later scenes in the novel. I want to look at one scene in chapter 11, which is kind of in the middle of the novel. This is after Dorian has kind of decided not to feel guilty over Sybil's death, has fully committed himself to this hedonistic aesthetic life. So now we are sort of in Dorian's point of view, right? Not Henry's point of view here. But the point here is that Lord Henry's influence has been successful. So this is in the middle of chapter 11. Yes, there was to be, as Lord Henry had prophesied, a new hedonism that was to recreate life and to save it from that harsh, uncomely Puritanism that is having, in our own day, its curious revival. It was to have its service of the intellect, certainly, yet it was never to accept any theory or system that would involve the sacrifice of any mode of passionate experience. Its aim, indeed, was to be experience itself, and not the fruits of experience, sweet or bitter as they might be. Of the asceticism that deadens the senses, as of the vulgar profligacy that dulls them, it was to know nothing. But it was to teach man to concentrate himself upon the moments of a life that is itself but a moment. So he is totally embodying Henry's philosophy here, right? He is totally basically embodying this new hedonism. A lot of the language here, by the way, pretty directly mirrors the writings of Walter Pater, who was, in some ways, you could say kind of the godfather of aestheticism, a writer who, especially in his book on the Renaissance, really argued for, this same idea. He said, it's not the fruit of experience, but experience itself that matters, right? Not about what you will get from it, but the experience itself. And so I think Wilde is very purposefully using a lot of the same language as Walter Pater. You could argue some people have interpreted Lord Henry as kind of a stylized version of Walter Pater. However you look at it, though, the point here is that Dorian has rejected Victorian morality completely. What does he call it in this passage? He calls it the harsh, uncomely Puritanism that is having in our own day its curious revival. And he has embodied everything that Lord Henry has taught him. But it's really the paragraph after this that I want to look at, because this is a very beautiful moment that Oscar Wilde writes through the lens of this new philosophy. So the very next paragraph. There are few of us who have not sometimes wakened before dawn, either after one of those dreamless nights that make us almost enamored of death, or one of those nights of horror and misshapen joy, when through the chambers of the brain sweep phantoms more terrible than reality itself, and instinct with that vivid life that lurks in all grotesques, and that lends to Gothic art its enduring vitality, this art being, one might fancy, especially the art of those whose minds have been troubled with the malady of reverie. So he's describing, right, waking up from either a dream or a nightmare, and he really lingers on the images of nightmares, right, which he says, lends to Gothic art its enduring vitality. Gradually, white fingers creep through the curtains, and they appear to tremble. In black, fantastic shapes, dumb shadows crawl into the corners of the room and crouch there. Outside there is the stirring of birds among the leaves, or the sound of men going forth to their work, or the sigh and sob of the wind coming down from the hills and wandering round the silent house, as though it feared to wake the sleepers, and yet must needs call forth sleep from her purple cave. So he's describing then the sounds of the morning, right? The kind of images of the morning, this experience of waking up from a dream or a nightmare and kind of becoming aware of the real world again. Veil after veil of thin dusky gauze is lifted, and by degrees the forms and colors of things are restored to them, and we watch the dawn remaking the world in its antique pattern. The wan mirrors get back their mimic life. The flameless tapers stand where we had left them, and beside them lies the half-cut book that we had been studying, or the wired flower that we had worn at the ball, or the letter that we had been afraid to read, or that we had read too often. Nothing seems to us changed. Out of the unreal shadows of the night comes back the real life that we had known. We have to resume it where we had left off, and there steals over us a terrible sense of the necessity for the continuance of energy in the same wearisome round of stereotyped habits, or a wild longing, it may be, that our eyelids might open some morning upon a world that had been refashioned anew in the darkness for our pleasure, a world in which things would have fresh shapes and colors and be changed, or have other secrets, a world in which the past would have little or no place, or survive at any rate in no conscious form of obligation or regret, the remembrance even of joy having its bitterness, and the memories of pleasure and their pain. So he's essentially saying, wouldn't it be something to wake up one morning and to feel that the world was not the same world that you knew from before, but that the world had changed somehow, and that you were, what does he say? You were no longer obligated to the past. He kind of is asking us to imagine, wouldn't it be something to wake up and you don't have to feel any sense of obligation or any sense of regret? I mean, that's essentially what he's describing is Dorian's new way of seeing the world now that he has embodied Lord Henry's philosophy. The next paragraph confirms it, so let's look at this next paragraph. It was the creation of such worlds as these that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object, or amongst the true objects of life. And in his search for sensations that would be at once new and delightful, and possess that element of strangeness that is so essential to romance, he would often adopt certain modes of thought that he knew to be really alien to his nature, abandon himself to their subtle influences, and then, having, as it were, caught their color and satisfied his intellectual curiosity, leave them with that curious indifference that is not incompatible with a real ardor of temperament, and that indeed, according to certain modern psychologists, is often a condition of it. So the point there is really the first part of that sentence. It was the creation of such worlds as these that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object of life. In other words, he realizes now, under the influence of this new philosophy, that it's all about making the present as new as possible, that each day when you wake up, you want to feel like the world is totally new, full of new sensations, new colors, new shapes, and not the old familiar world. Right? This is Dorian approaching Lord Henry's ideal of a person who lives purely for experience, a person who lives purely for aesthetics, who is not bound, as it says, by obligation or regret. Now, we know how this novel ends. This is not the final stage that Dorian will reach. He will, by the end of this novel, feel immense obligation and immense regret. But at this moment, in the middle of the novel, it's like he's achieved Lord Henry's dream. Now, notice the point of view. Oscar Wilde puts us in a different point of view than Dorian's. I think that's essential. He does not say that we wake up like Dorian. Notice the way he phrases this passage. He says, we wake up and it's the same old world. It's the same old world every time we wake up. What does he say? He says, wouldn't it be something for us to wake up in a different world? I think that's essential, the way he uses the word we in this passage. We are not identified with Dorian in this passage. He does not describe Dorian waking up. He describes us waking up as we wake up every day. And then he says Dorian was different. So, once again, whose point of view are we in? We are actually not in Dorian's point of view, really. We are in the point of view of ordinary people in Victorian England, and Dorian, as he is to Lord Henry, is this fascinating object, this fascinating figure who has escaped our ordinary world. Again, I love that passage for the way Wilde plays with point of view and the way it's consistent. Even though there are passages in this novel where we experience the world as Dorian experiences, time and time again, Wilde returns to this perspective. He positions us in Lord Henry's perspective, and he positions us outside of Dorian's perspective, because we are not Dorian. We are ordinary Victorians for whom Dorian is an ideal, and as we're going to see, an ideal that's going to fail. So I want to talk about one chapter in particular towards the end, chapter 19, which I think is one of the kind of not quite the climax of the novel, because obviously the climax of the novel has to do with, Dorian's decision to rip up the portrait. But I think kind of the emotional climax in many ways of the novel, and especially of Lord Henry's story, really comes in chapter 19. Now, in this context, remember, Lord Henry is older now, and Dorian is the same. 20 years have passed now, right, since the opening scene of the novel that we discussed, where Dorian has declared that he doesn't want to age. And I find, actually, this chapter very moving because, of course, Henry has aged, right? He is not like Dorian. He can't stay young forever. And there's a really beautiful passage in here where Henry kind of laments the fact that he's grown old. So let's look at these two kind of long paragraphs. And the context here is Dorian is feeling very sad about things at this point in the novel. Dorian sees Sybil's brother James kind of pursuing him, and he starts to grow afraid. He starts to be reminded of his guilt around Sybil. And then James is accidentally killed by a hunter in a kind of deus ex machina almost, right? And Dorian is so affected by this, he decides basically that he needs to start living a better life, that he cannot be this amoral person anymore. And basically, specifically, he tells this to Henry in this scene. And Henry essentially, so I think what's crucial here is this is one of the first moments where Dorian is now starting to reject Lord Henry's influence. He is no longer the person we saw in the middle who is only concerned with new experiences. He is burdened now by regret and by guilt, and it's changing him. So let's take a look at this line, right, which Henry says to Dorian kind of in the middle. So Dorian is basically telling Henry he does believe that there is such a thing as a soul. And what is Lord Henry's response? He says, then it must be an illusion. The things one feels absolutely certain about are never true. That is the fatality of faith and the lesson of romance. How grave you are. Don't be so serious. What have you or I to do with the superstitions of our age? No, we have given up our belief in the soul. Play me something. Play me a nocturne, Dorian, and as you play, tell me, in a low voice, how you have kept your youth. You must have some secret. I am only 10 years older than you are, and I am wrinkled and worn and yellow. You are really wonderful, Dorian. You have never looked more charming than you do tonight. You remind me of the day I saw you first. You were rather cheeky, very shy, and absolutely extraordinary. You have changed, of course, but not in appearance. I wish you would tell me your secret. To get back my youth, I would do anything in the world, except take exercise, get up early, or be respectable. Youth. There is nothing like it. So let's pause here for a moment. Obviously, there's a bit of tongue-in-cheek humor that Wilde can't help but drop in there, right? Where he says, except exercise, get up early, or be respectable. But I think regardless of that, Henry is being very serious here. He really feels this. This is the most earnest and emotionally direct Henry is going to be in this novel. And he's telling Dorian, you must have some secret. And I wish you would tell me the secret. Now, obviously, the irony is we as the audience, we know his secret, right? So we are actually at some distance from Henry here. But remember, we started this novel in Henry's perspective. Oscar Wilde was kind of forcing us to inhabit the point of view of this man who is essentially like himself, this person who desires aestheticism, who desires a life freed from Victorian morality. Henry has now gotten his wish. Dorian became the very person Henry wanted. And the tragedy, I think, that Wilde is dramatizing here is that this is not enough. Because it obviously affects Dorian in this really negative way, right? He's unable to let go of regret. He's unable to be that person, right, forever. But Henry, too, is unable to be that person forever because he has to age and he has to grow old. And I think Wilde is saying something very astute here about aestheticism and about the tragedy of aestheticism, is it's impossible to live a purely aesthetic life because we age. Lord Henry can't live this life himself because he grows old. He has created and influenced Dorian to be this perfect aesthetic ideal, and even that is not enough, right? And what does Lord Henry want at the end? He wants to know the secret. He wishes Dorian would tell him how he's able to stay alive forever. And the true tragedy and irony is that Lord Henry doesn't realize it was his influence, right? It was his influence that gave Dorian the secret of eternal life. I find this to be very, very tragic and in a very fascinating way, because again, if Lord Henry really is a Mephistopheles figure, if he really is the devil, what Oscar Wilde has done here, he's given the devil a real emotional depth, and he's made us feel for this devil. I think, again, whose point of view do we connect with here? It might be fun to imagine ourselves to be in Dorian's point of view, but we will never have the experiences that Dorian has in this novel. No, the person who we are actually like in this novel is Lord Henry. We grow old. We cannot stay young forever. And so in this particular passage, I think Lord Henry is the one who we really empathize with. And that, points to my interpretation of this novel as it's not a critique of aestheticism, but it dramatizes and laments the fact that that living this type of purely aesthetic life is impossible. Not just in Victorian England, but perhaps even as human beings, because of the fact of aging, because of the fact of time, right? And Lord Henry seems to lament that fact right here. If we keep reading this passage, because I think it's quite moving and quite good. It's absurd to talk of the ignorance of youth. The only people to whose opinions I listen now with any respect are people much younger than myself. They seem in front of me. Life has revealed to them her latest wonder. As for the aged, I always contradict the aged. I do it on principle. If you ask them their opinion on something that happened yesterday, they solemnly give you the opinions current in 1820, when people wore high stocks, believed in everything, and knew absolutely nothing. How lovely that thing you are playing is. I wonder, did Chopin write it at Majorca, with the sea weeping round the villa and the salt spray dashing against the panes? It is marvelously romantic. What a blessing it is that there is one art left to us that is not imitative. Don't stop. I want music tonight. It seems to me that you are the young Apollo, and that I am Marsyas, listening to you. I have sorrows, Dorian, of my own that even you know nothing of. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is young. I am amazed sometimes at my own sincerity. Ah, Dorian, how happy you are. What an exquisite life you have had. You have drunk deeply of everything. You have crushed the grapes against your palate. Nothing has been hidden from you. And it has all been to you no more than the sound of music. It has not marred you. You are still the same. So again, I love that passage, the pathos that Henry is expressing in this passage. I have sorrows, Dorian, of my own that even you know nothing of. Again, Henry is not just a frivolous, surface-level character. He is a very emotionally complex and deep character, and this passage really brings it all together. What are his sorrows? What are his tragedies? It's that on the inside, he still feels young, even though he is old. It's the exact inverse of Dorian. Dorian, on the outside, is young, but on the inside doesn't feel that way. Lord Henry feels the opposite. And again, it's the tragedy of aestheticism. That's what Wilde is describing here. The tragedy that this worldview that Wilde himself believes in and embodies, this worldview of Walter Pater, right, who inspires so much of the values of this novel, that this worldview is impossible to sustain because Lord Henry grows old. Now look at Dorian's response. He says, I am not the same, Harry. But more interesting is now Henry's response to that, because he doesn't believe him. He says, yes, you are the same. I wonder what the rest of your life will be. Don't spoil it by renunciations. At present, you are a perfect type. Don't make yourself incomplete. You are quite flawless now. You need not shake your head. You know you are. Besides, Dorian, don't deceive yourself. Life is not governed by will or intention. Life is a question of nerves and fibers, and slowly built up cells in which thought hides itself and passion has its dreams. You may fancy yourself safe and think yourself strong, but a chance tone of color in a room, or a morning sky, a particular perfume that you had once loved, and that brings subtle memories with it, a line from a forgotten poem that you had come across again, a cadence from a piece of music that you had ceased to play. I tell you, Dorian, that it is on things like these that our lives depend. Browning writes about that somewhere, but our own senses will imagine them for us. There are moments when the odor of lilas blanc passes suddenly across me, and I have to live the strangest month of my life over again. I wish I could change places with you, Dorian. The world has cried out against us both, but it has always worshipped you. It always will worship you. You are the type of what the age is searching for, and what it is afraid it has found. I am so glad that you have never done anything, never carved a statue or painted a picture, or produced anything outside of yourself. Life has been your art. You have set yourself to music. Your days are your sonnets. So, Henry is basically telling Dorian, right, about his own tragedies. He's saying there are moments in his life where a smell passes before him, or he sees a particular color, and he starts remembering, right, things from the past. Again, what is he talking about there? He's talking about what does it mean to live so attuned to art and aesthetics, things like color and smell and music. Henry is describing the tragedy of it, right? Because again, remember, the whole point is that Henry is old now. He has aged. He is no longer the young person we met at the beginning of the novel. All of these sensory experiences become tragic for Henry because they become associated with memories from the past. Colors, sounds, smells. The tragedy here is that he's essentially saying he can no longer live a life of pure experience. He can no longer just experience the color of a sunset or the scent, right, of flowers, because it reminds him of something from the past. Again, that's the tragedy of aestheticism. Aestheticism, as we saw from that earlier paragraph, was pushing people to live purely based on experience. And Lord Henry is saying here at the end, that's no longer possible for him because he's grown old. And he worships Dorian because he feels that Dorian, because he's still young, doesn't have to suffer those things, doesn't have to worry, right, about things like memory. Now, of course, obviously Dorian has other things to worry about, right? The regret that we touched on earlier. And the novel, of course, ends with him stabbing the portrait, unable to live the life that Henry had wanted him to live. So I think, obviously, why does he stab the portrait at the end? It's obviously his guilt. But I would argue it's also because of this speech right here, because of this interaction he has with Henry. In a way, right, what Henry has constantly influenced Dorian throughout his whole life. This whole novel has been about Henry's influence, the things and speeches that Henry makes, and the way Dorian internalizes them. These last lines by Henry about the tragedy of old age, what these last lines do is they're the final influence on Dorian. I think implicitly, one reason Dorian stabs the portrait at the end is these lines that Henry has just said, right, about aging, about memory. Dorian, of course, is interpreting them totally differently than Henry intends. They are affecting him differently because of his guilt, right, because of what he feels on the inside. If we look at that final section where he does finally stab the painting, this is in chapter 20, just take a look at this moment. When he reached home, he found his servant waiting up for him. He sent him to bed and threw himself down on the sofa in the library and began to think over some of the things that Lord Henry had said to him. So again, Lord Henry's influence continues, even in this final chapter. Was it really true that one could never change? He felt a wild longing for the unstained purity of his boyhood, his rose-white boyhood, as Lord Henry had once called it. He knew that he had tarnished himself, filled his mind with corruption, and given horror to his fancy, that he had been an evil influence to others, and had experienced a terrible joy in being so, and that of the lives that had crossed his own, it had been the fairest and the most full of promise that he had brought to shame. But was it all irretrievable? Was there no hope for him? Right, so he's thinking of Lord Henry's kind of final words to him. And what is he feeling here? It says he felt a wild longing for the unstained purity of his boyhood. Now that's really interesting because Lord Henry talked about this kind of nostalgia as well, that is inspired by certain feelings, certain colors, certain sensory experiences. In a way, even though Dorian has not aged, on the inside he has. On the inside, he still feels what Lord Henry felt as an old man. He still feels nostalgia for youth. Only for Dorian, it's a nostalgia for the purity of boyhood and the purity of youth. And obviously he thinks about the people that he's wronged, right? Sybil, of course, and then of course Basil, right, who he killed. And he's implicitly thinking about both of them, right? The terrible deeds that he's committed, as well as all the other things, right? And the result is that he's sort of like, was it all irretrievable? Was there no hope for him? And essentially, right, you could argue that he is actually feeling the same things that Lord Henry is feeling. He is feeling the regret that he can't go back to his youth, that he can't go back to the person he was. And so what Oscar Wilde is implicitly saying here is that youth is not just external. Youth is not just on the outside. It is on the inside. Dorian Gray might be young on the outside, but he is not young on the inside. On the inside, he is feeling the same things Lord Henry was feeling. Now let's think about the sort of, kind of reflect on the novel as a whole now, draw some larger conclusions here. As I've been saying, so, we can read this novel in which both Dorian and Henry are the protagonists. In what way are they the protagonists? Well, both of them, right, are motivated by aestheticism. Lord Henry is motivated to influence Dorian by aestheticism. Again, think of the opening, how we begin with an image associated with the movement, right? This beautiful Japanese kind of painting that Lord Henry thinks of as he smells the flowers and sees the view outside Lord Henry is motivated by aestheticism, by this desire for kind of a perfect, pure, artistic life, a life lived on experience alone. And Dorian, of course, is influenced by Henry to try and live that life as well. So Dorian fails to successfully live that life, right? Because he can't purely let go of morality. He can't actually be that perfect aesthetic figure that Lord Henry wanted. Lord Henry, meanwhile, he is also filled with regret because of aging. So to conclude, what is Oscar Wilde trying to say with this novel? I think it's overly simplistic, like I said at the beginning, to see this as a critique of aestheticism. Wilde is clearly lamenting that aestheticism can't be a reality. He clearly believes a lot of the things that Lord Henry believes about art, about life. Oscar Wilde is no traditional Victorian moralist. He believes a lot of the things that Lord Henry believes. But he's also acknowledging that many of those things are impossible to make real. That you can't actually live this life of pure experience. And why not? Because of the reality of aging and the reality of time. And I think the true kind of masterstroke here, and this is why I think, again, thinking of it as purely a Gothic novel misses the point, right? Yes, Dorian doesn't age. That's the kind of magical Gothic element of the novel. But really, he does age. He ages on the inside. The character of Dorian we see at the ending, this mature, self-reflective, anguished character, is nothing like the person we met at the beginning. Right? He has changed significantly over the course of the novel. Grown cynical, grown morbid, grown melancholy. He has aged. And that's the true tragedy of this novel, is that what Dorian wished for at the beginning, that the portrait would age and he would not, didn't really come true, because he did continue to age. Time did affect him. Time made him regretful. Time made him desire, as it says at the end, the purity of his boyhood, just as time affected Lord Henry. That's, I think, the real pathos and beauty of this novel. It is a novel about the passage of time. Remember, we've talked about the passage of time before. The Age of Innocence was all about the passage of time. This, too, is a lament for the passage of time, and a lament that these aesthetic values could not be made real. All right, so thank you guys for being here and for listening. I hope that this gets you to rethink Dorian Gray a little bit, to reread it, and to think of it and realize that it's much more complex than it's sometimes described as in the culture. And hopefully this gives you a new appreciation for Lord Henry Wotton, who is one of my favorite characters, I think one of the best characters in all of literature. And again, much more complex, right, than the stereotypes suggest. All right, so that's it for this week. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you all next time.